and then introduce Angela Potochnik from the University of Cincinnati, who in a sense is the reason why this workshop is happening, because we were hoping back in the innocent days of the spring to have a real life visit from Angela this September, but that wasn't happening. This workshop is some compensation, and so thanks to her for that, and for the talk today, which will be on the title "Why It Matters That Idealizations Are False."
Thanks, Al, for putting this together, this workshop. Thanks for including me. Thanks everyone else for hanging in there through this last talk. And James, thanks for having a title for your talk that is like the perfect setup for my talk as well. So I feel like I'll never have this perfect of a sort of pairing of titles again. It was really fun, including your talk as well. So I'll try along the way to gesture at sort of where we might connect. So there's been a tension in recent years, as we've talked about in at least a couple of the other talks, I think Arnold's and James, to how idealizations facilitate explanation and understanding, and how this might compromise veritism or factivism about explanation, the idea that explanations include only true claims. So this sort of a line is taken by people besides me, and also it's important to note influencing me, by Kate Elgin, Elisa Bakulich, Hank Direct, Arnon Levy, others. All of these names have already come up today, I believe, in various other talks. Others, on the other hand, have motivated ways to accommodate idealization's contribution while remaining committed to only truths explaining. So names on this list include, among others, Michael Strevens, Uskuli Maki, Kareem Khalifa, Insa Lawler, Chris Pincock. I think James will put himself on this list, and others as well, although I see more in the middle. Okay, so the motivation for this talk is that I'm increasingly convinced that much of what's been said for and against truth, facticity, etc., regarding idealization and some related topics is actually compatible. It's a matter, I think, in the end, on a lot of these fronts of sort of what we choose to emphasize. I have this feeling, my instinct anyway, is if we all sit in a room long enough, we'll be able to sort of crystallize the translation changes we'll have to make, etc., such that we all sort of roughly agree with the same points. But I don't think that what we choose to emphasize, this sort of matter of emphasis issue, if I'm right about that interpretation of where the debate's gotten, is purely a matter of taste. I think that there's more at stake than that. So this is an attempt to sort of zoom out and get it more explicitly, advocate a picture of why one should emphasize the contribution made by idealizations, falsity. So it engages directly, I think, with a point that I heard James make about the factivists versus the non-factivists and how that plays out. And in particular, sort of, I think you said along the way, James, that there's this matter of this sort of starting assumption, is I think the term that you use, that folks of one stripe or another have. One other thing that I want to mention, just because James and to some extent, maybe the other talks were focusing in on models in particular, I think this is a much broader debate. I think models are a really natural point to see idealizations, because we've all, as a philosophical community, sort of come along on the path far enough that we sort of see how idealizations function there. But I think that everything that's said in the context of model-based science is true more broadly in scientific work, with certainly some exceptions, but with lots of other styles of science as well. So one other preliminary comment, I want to define explicitly what I mean by idealizations. Some also use, idealizations, I think, are assumptions made without regard for whether they're true, and at least often with full knowledge that they're actually false. So some also use idealization to refer to a representation that involves idealizations in this sense. It's important for my purposes to distinguish between idealizations themselves and the idealized representations that they facilitate. So putting it briefly, it may be that idealized representations are approximately true, or et cetera, choose your term. But I think that it's clear that idealizations themselves are false, or at least they're not posited as true. They're not claimed to be true. And the point of this talk will be that matters. That role played by idealizations is important to what's going on with science. All right. So here's the plan. First of all, my aim is not to convince you that truth-centric accounts of the role of idealization and explanation are impossible to maintain, right? That you can't do it by being a veritist, et cetera. Rather, I want to show something different. First of all, I want to show that there's a strong case to make that idealizations directly contribute to scientific understanding in virtue of their falsity. Note that it's not despite their falsity, right, I think, but even in virtue of their falsity. There's something important happening epistemically and for our understanding in virtue of that falsity. So I think that misrepresentation itself can augment scientific understanding. And then secondly, my second point is going to be that emphasizing this contribution of idealizations, rather than focusing solely on ways in which our scientific explanations are true or approximately true if we squint, et cetera, can actually improve our accounts of understanding, explanation, and even representation, although I won't have much to say about representation or maybe anything to say about representation in this talk. So perhaps factivism about understanding and explanation can be maintained, but I think it's philosophically fruitful to focus on the epistemic contributions of misrepresentation itself, or what I want to say is misrepresentation. And what I have phrased here is abandoning veritism. All right, so on to the first order point, how idealizations aid understanding in virtue of their falsity in a way that has, I think, representational oomph. This discussion draws substantially from my 2017 book that I already mentioned, as well as though on the work by several other philosophers. And it's worth pointing out that I am trying to take on fewer commitments here than I do in my book. I'm sort of trying to just paint a broad picture that if you're more or less on board with, I should be able to use to motivate the second main point of this talk. So let's start with another preliminary. Idealizations contribute to scientific understanding. We can conclude this from the fact that many of our most heralded scientific explanations involve idealizations. What's more, these idealized explanations are maintained even when more accurate representations, that is, representations that replace one or more of these idealized assumptions with accurate claims or more accurate claims, are available. Explanations like this include the ideal gas law, as well as van der Waals equations for gases, the Hardy-Weinberg law, as well as optimality models for evolution, rational choice theory accounts of economic phenomena, and so on. I take it that this much is agreed upon across the parties of the debate that I gestured at the beginning. Idealizations, or departures from the truth, are permissible in explanations and can contribute positively to our understanding. What's more at issue seems at first to be whether this is in virtue of the falsity of idealizations or despite it. And second, whether the explanatory value of idealizations is properly epistemic or something sort of secondary and not sort of important to the epistemic ends of science. All right, so consider the first of those questions. Why think that the contribution idealizations make to understanding is in virtue of their falsity, as I've said? This, I think, would be utterly mysterious if the only success condition for explanation obtained to how explanations relate to the world. That is, to whatever it is that accounts for the phenomenon to be explained. This is often called the ontic explanation, or we could say the ontic dimension of explanation. This is, as I'll refer to it anyway, the object of understanding. One understands that X because Y. False posits clearly do not contribute to accurate representation, at least not in virtue of their inaccuracy, right? We have to do some fancy work to speak about the regards in which they are and turns out accurate. And this is a bit of the picture that James focused in on. But this is not the only kind of success condition on explanation. Explanations also must be structured such that they have the potential to generate understanding, and understanding is a cognitive state, as well as an epistemic success, of course. So explanations must relate to the objects of understanding in the right way to succeed, but so too they must relate to the subjects of understanding in the right way in order to succeed. For a successful explanation, the relevant subject S must be able to understand that X because Y. So improvements on an explanation can be made with regard to its representation of the object of understanding, as well as with regard to its ability to address the cognitive needs of the subject of understanding. Presumably, the former requires representational accuracy, but the latter task is something to which idealizations could possibly contribute in virtue of their falsity, not despite it. Here's why we should think idealizations regularly do contribute to achieving the cognitive state of understanding in virtue of their falsity. Our world is complex, and our understanding benefits from artificially reducing the complexity to get a handle on focal features of the phenomenon to be understood. All right. So I've claimed that idealizations can directly contribute to the production of understanding in virtue of their falsity by helping explanations relate properly to the subjects of understanding, in particular to their cognitive needs. This might at first sound merely pragmatic. In fact, I think it's often said to be merely pragmatic. But that view, I think, is symptomatic of a broader trend in the literature on scientific explanation to minimize the role of explanation seekers in shaping explanations. This is what's led to the so-called ontic accounts of explanation that a handful of philosophers of science explicitly endorse, but also a much broader trend that I think almost all, if not all, philosophers of science implicitly endorse, which is the expectation that our subjective interests can shape merely the explanandum, how the explanandum is characterized, but not anything about the explanans. This is something we've inherited from, I think, Hempel on, and folks have seem to be content with. In contrast to this, I think that idealization's contribution to scientific explanation and understanding is epistemic in nature. Consider, first of all, that there can be no epistemic achievement without explanations relating properly to the subjects of understanding. And second of all, there can be no ontic explanation without the subjects of understanding first setting the explanatory agenda. And this goes much beyond, I think, settling on an explanandum. I'm not going to defend that point with argument today, but I have arguments. I'm happy to provide them. I resist the interpretation of this as mere stage setting, facilitation, or enabling, in part because I think this role is naturally construed as representational. In this use, idealizations are used not just to avoid representing complicating detail, but to affirmatively represent aspects of the world as being simpler than they are, as being Newtonian instead of relativistic, as being infinite in size instead of the discrete number, et cetera, et cetera. So let's call this representation as if. Representation as if, or how I'm using that term, is the idea that idealizations represent matters as if something is the case that actually does not obtain. So I think that this does have representational content, but the content is not accurate description of the state of affairs, but rather stipulation of the conditions in which the explanation obtains. Consider the well-worn example of infinite population size. This idealization enables evolutionary explanations ranging from population genetic explanations in terms of the Hardy-Weinberg equation to evolutionary ecology explanations in terms of game theory. Of course, no population is infinite in size, nor in my view does this signal that actual population size is causally irrelevant to the phenomenon. This is the sort of view that Michael Strevens maintains, as we talked about a bit earlier. Rather, when one seeks to understand the role of selection in shaping allele distribution with Hardy-Weinberg, or the role of ecological factors in shaping phenotypic traits with game theory, the infinite population size idealization represents the population as if it were infinite, signaling thereby, and this is where you have to listen closely if you're convinced by James, signaling thereby that the explanation obtains so long as the actual population size, the source of genetic drift, doesn't interfere with the precise relationship that the explanation seekers in fact aim to use to explain the phenomenon, right? So this is highly sort of nuanced consideration from my point of view that is indexed to the explanation seekers' goals. And these are, in the two examples I'm sort of quickly using here, allele distribution and phenotypic trait, respectively. And notice that those two different aims, specific representational aims, will give rise to two different ranges of conditions in which the infinite population idealization will succeed. Different sets of phenomena when you can employ that fairly from one another. So notice it'd be misleading to say that this representational content is why such idealizing assumptions are employed. Idealizations, I think, are not generally employed to signal this or something like that. That's another way in which I part ways from Michael Strevens. Rather, idealizations just have tons of practical usefulness, right? They help science, they oil the engine of science or the gears of science in all sorts of different ways. as well as, I think, epistemic value to the subjects of understanding. That's been the bit of Idealizations' role that important bit, but only a part of Idealizations' role that I've focused in on so far. But I do think Idealizations acquire this representational content as an effect of their maintenance in explanations that we have deemed to be successful by our standards for explanation. All right, so to summarize the view that I've sketched, Idealizations contribute positively to explanations and the understanding they produce. This contribution is in virtue of Idealizations' falsity, in virtue of the elimination of complicating details that, were those represented more accurately, would actually interfere, hinder the subject's grasp of the features they seek to understand. Moreover, Idealizations' contribution does not simply consist in facilitating veridical representation, but in affirmative misrepresentation of the phenomenon to be explained in sort of highly specific respects. By representing things as if they are different than they are, Idealizations stipulate the conditions in which the proffered explanation applies. Because understanding is an epistemic achievement, there is epistemic value to sacrificing some accuracy or truth, to affirmatively misrepresenting in scientific explanations. All right, point 2 of 2, moving on. Here's the second order point. This is where I want the bulk of my attention to be. Why this kind of a philosophical view, emphasizing the epistemic value of Idealizations to explanations in virtue of their falsehood, is worth taking. So why agree with this sort of a view when you could, I think, probably re-say everything that I've said such that you can maintain veritism or factivism at the same time. So here's why. Here's why it is worth abandoning veritism. Let's start with the factivity issue. Here are some considerations based on the first half of my talk. I take it that, first of all, S can understand that X because Y, even if Y is not entirely true. And second of all, it's possible that Y may actually better explain X for S than Z does, even if Y is less accurate than Z. So this is a point that Arnon mentioned also, especially with regards to van der Waals equation and Boyle's law. Okay, so note that these points trace back to the epistemically crucial relationship explanation bears to the subject of understanding S, right? I have to have S in these sentences in order to make my point. All of this said, my priority is not to win the factivism battle, as I've said. Maybe factivism or quasi-factivism, as Karim Khalifa adopts, can be maintained. But as long as, sorry, I missed my third claim. Third claim, a claim C can be part of an account of YX, even if C is radically false. I just realized I missed putting up my third point once I referred in my notes to my my 3 claims. Sorry about that. Okay, so maybe factivism or quasi-factivism can be maintained, but as long as these 3 claims are acknowledged and attended to while someone calls themselves a veritist or a factivist about explanation or understanding, that's okay with me. This is what is at stake for me. I want these three claims to be maintained. Yes. All right. So what I do want to talk about is what's to be gained by acknowledging or attending to these observations, to those 3 claims that were so important. I forgot one of the 3. 3 features of scientific explanation, at least, I think, remain mysterious if we do not posit the epistemic value of compromising accuracy or truth. First of all, there is the persistence of idealized explanations when more realistic alternatives are available, right? Boyle's law, van der Waals equations. Idealizations can't, in that case, idealizations can't be justified by their contribution to truth. Idealized representations, models, general laws, etc., can be called approximately true, but the actual false assumptions themselves, and especially their maintenance when it could be possible to eliminate those false assumptions in favor of less obvious falsehoods, assumptions that are closer to being true, that can't be motivated by focusing on truth as an epistemic end. We need to talk about something different to make sense of that choice that's made. So for example, as I've already mentioned along the way, the ideal gas law is not just a step on the way to van der Waals equation. Once we have access to van der Waals equation, we're done with Boyle's law. There are much more important roles, much more significant roles, including epistemic roles, that the ideal gas law continues to play for us in science. So a second point, another thing that we need something more than appeals to truth to make sense of. It's possible to have multiple scientific accounts of a single phenomenon. Indeed, this is common. Once we sort of start looking for these instances, you just find them from everywhere. We see non-competing varieties of understanding tailored to different research projects. For example, this little picture of Western bluebirds here, unless I have mountain bluebirds, but it doesn't matter. They both factor into the research that I'm going to talk about. Western bluebird research, I'm thinking especially, no, I've lost the scientist's name. Sorry, I can't tell you the name of the scientist whose lab research I'm thinking of off the top of my head, sorry. At any rate, Western bluebird research idealizes away behavioral variation when accounting for species range. You pretend that all of the Western bluebirds have the same behavioral strategies when in fact those vary and are known to be frequent, variable within the population. This research idealizes away from environmental change in turn when accounting for the success of different behavioral strategies. So now you're talking about the success of different behavioral strategies, and you hold the environment constant and pretend that the environment is stable, when in fact all of these researchers know that forest fires in particular and recolonization after forest fires is very important overall to Western bluebird population distribution. Each of these idealizations, when sort of made in the context of highly specific aims of understanding, makes the knowledge that's gained through their use broader, more exportable than if the researchers had instead worked toward a more accurate integrated account of this system, Western bluebird distribution in particular. So in this case, we're talking Renee Duckworth, I have her name. We're talking about research conducted in one lab, Renee Duckworth's lab, which I believe it is at Arizona State, if my memory is not failing me on that as well. But even with the same researchers doing this work, they don't choose to sort of come up with an integrated account of the Western bluebirds population distribution, but rather to isolate these individual features of that focal system. Such multiple accounts, different varieties of understanding, are to be expected if idealization's contribution to explanation is indexed to the cognitive needs and interests of those seeking explanation, as those vary, right? The cognitive needs, the interests of the researchers that they bring to bear to their research vary, even if they're focusing on the same sets of phenomena. The value of this to science is apparent. Focusing on only one variety of understanding makes the resulting account more broadly applicable and more exportable, more general, as Alkistis was focused on in her talk, than if the researchers worked toward a more accurate integrated account of this system in particular. In contrast, this multiplicity of accounts isn't readily explainable if the epistemic value of the elements of an explanation is always cashed out in terms of approximate truth of the object of understanding. You're going to get a more true account if you can develop an integrated account of Western bluebird population distribution in particular. All right, third, explanations bear the mark of the particular individuals who developed them, the subjects of understanding, as I've wanted to talk about from the beginning of this talk, in a way that goes beyond simply uncovering what is true about objects of understanding. Scientists' representational choices, including what to emphasize, what to take into account, what to idealize, can't influence what's true of the world. But these are inarguably decision points that bear on the nature of the explanations scientists generate. In this way, specifics of the research agenda that is pursued shape the resulting explanation. This is like the mundane point that scientists seek important truths, not just any truths. But the extent of the choice is much greater, I think, than simply choosing which phenomena to investigate. The choice of what to focus on, what variety of insight to seek, occurs even when the phenomenon of interest is settled on, right? There are these downstream questions, I think, about what form of understanding S aims to achieve. Is it important to understand how changing access to resources leads Western bluebirds to colonize new areas? What leads some Western bluebirds to be colonizers and others to stay put? What accounts for the relative aggressiveness of Western bluebirds compared to mountain bluebirds? Whether interbreeding influences Western and mountain bluebirds when they're co-located, etc. This list just scratches the surface of what could be explained about this phenomenon. Each specific research focus is linked to quite different representational choices, different ranges of similar phenomena, different bodies of background knowledge, etc., etc. All right, so these are three important features of science that I think we need to make sense of, and sort of just referencing the accuracy of our representations or their truthiness doesn't get us an account of. These points all, zooming out from that, most basically, granting the importance of principled misrepresentation to scientific explanation shows how the epistemic successes of formulating genuine explanations, of coming to understand, are, as I've said from the beginning here, relational achievements. Science is not just about depicting truths, even important truths. It's an exercise in connecting human agents to the world in ways that are cognitively and often practically useful. Sometimes depicting simple truths does provide this connection. But other times, lots of other times, the connection bears more of a mark of the human agent side of the connection than that. This can take any number of forms, but one important variety is when artificially simplifying our account of some phenomenon enables subjects to grasp an important feature of that phenomenon, to glean why it should be that way and what would have happened if things had been otherwise. Idealization, using simple assumptions to smooth out some of the world's complexity, is an essential step of many instances of coming to understand, at least in science. So this general role for idealization, one of several roles, accounts for why idealizations are present in so many of our scientific explanations, and it accounts for why idealizations are voluntarily maintained when more realistic alternatives are available. It also accounts for as I've talked about already, the proliferation of different explanations in science, explanations that capture different features of the same or closely related target phenomena. There's also a related observation here to make about our world. Our world is not, it turns out, one in which there's only one story to give about a given occurrence. Rather, it's richly complex. There's room for multiple accounts that are individually enlightening, and it sort of spurs us on to look for those multiple accounts rather than simple answers. So I take it that most of these general claims about science are pretty uncontroversial among philosophers of science. At least it's the case that similar claims have been made in different philosophical debates about science. Rejecting a simple veritism about explanation for something more nuanced that affords a distinctive central role for idealization as a departure from truth, thus fits neatly into this kind of a sort of broader view of science that other philosophers have developed. Also, I'm going to note, really just in passing, that although some emphasize scientific realism as a reason to preserve veritism about explanation, notice that none of what I've said here requires abandoning realism. Rather, I think that the point that I've made about explanation as a relational achievement actually has an allied position regarding realism. And I don't have enough time to tell you what it is, but I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A or another time. All right, so this view also suggests the importance of epistemic subjects in shaping the content of scientific knowledge. Perhaps more than any other feature of science, idealizations make clear the range of ways in which the practitioners and audiences of science shape the nature of scientific findings. Idealizations enable researchers to focus myopically in on exactly what they or others care about in a phenomenon. Idealizations can tailor a representation to an audience, which is why their role in textbooks has long been appreciated. They enable the reapplication of approaches a researcher happens to be familiar with to disparate phenomena. And in these ways and others, idealizations are a way of tailoring scientific knowledge to our cognitive needs. Among other things, which factors scientists focus on, what they seek to understand, is influenced by who they are and who their audience is. This is one reason it matters for our scientists to have diverse identities and ranges of experiences, something that's increasingly appreciated by not just philosophers, but scientists as well. It's also a reason that it matters who's funding our science, right? Is it the public or is it pharmaceutical companies? Turns out it's not irrelevant. And this in turn opens up an important discussion about science that's otherwise obscured. What kinds of knowledge are worth pursuing? This isn't just the obvious consideration of which phenomena to investigate, but the downstream decision of with what aims. Which features of any given phenomenon should we home in on, and which patterns should we seek knowledge of? I'm not giving this example. I'm moving on because I'm out of time. In my view, an underestimation of the world's complexity and the role of human subjects in shaping the content of scientific knowledge have led this important question, this important dimension of science, to be somewhat at least neglected in philosophy of science. All right, so wrapping up, we want something in science that usually doesn't technically exist. We want a simple answer to why. So what we do is we lie a little bit. We artificially simplify features that are incidental to our main focus, at least at the moment, in order to gain clarity and control over our world. We represent the world multiply so that we can represent it as simpler than it is. All of this is as it should be, given that our science is designed to respond to our epistemic needs. The mistake only arises if we refuse to acknowledge the epistemic importance of idealizations or of misrepresentations and the resulting partiality of our understanding. It may be possible to maintain factivism about explanation or to rehabilitate a version of this commitment, like with Khalifa's quasi-factivism. But I submit for consideration, this is not the default obvious option, obvious position to be maintained, to hold on to come what may. But rather, we should at least entertain the possibility that departures from the truth are epistemically important, and abandoning veritism does seem to do a good job of accounting for the importance of those departures from the truth. All right, thank you.